We are exploring a world that is just seeming more and more insane every day. And to start to look and figure out how and why this could be occurring, I have invited the wonderful Dr. Joy Pugh to join me here tonight. She is the author of numerous books, one being The Antichrist, the Cloned Image of Jesus Christ, and another, Eden, the Knowledge of Good and Evil, 666. And we're going to get deep into some topics you guys are going to not believe. So welcome to the show, Dr. Joy.
Hi, Freeman.
Hey, it's great to have you here.
Oh, I'm looking forward to our time together tonight because I feel like we're just going to be discussing some things that are quite interesting, and I think that we're just living in exciting times, especially if you are involved with wanting to see what's going to happen as far as the biblical revelations coming to pass in a generation in which we live.
Well, I have been turning out information related to the number of the beast, the 666, connected to VW, Fox, CERN, Procter & Gamble. I see it all over. I see it everywhere. But I wanted to start with you at the beginning. And as we go along, we'll work up to the Antichrist and how this
that sounds good.
Could possibly work out. So in the beginning, it seems that Genesis has two creation myths. Do you like to get into some of that?
Well, looking at this, and like I say, many times when we have actually come up in Sunday school and things like that we have been taught a certain way, and so we typically believe what we have, been taught. And I began looking at, what Genesis was really telling us, and I saw that apparently there was something very strange about the Genesis account, because it appeared that there were some terms being used that I thought was really kind of strange. We went from using a word called Elohim in the very first chapter to Lord God in the second chapter, and the fact that the words that God used to replenish the earth made it seem to me that there had actually happened something prior to, before the time of Adam and Eve. And so the fact that the word replenish is used there before they're created, and then it comes up that, they're supposed to replenish, then there had to be something beforehand. And that same word is also used when Noah and his family, get off the ark. The word replenish again is used. So I really do believe that there was something happening prior to the creation of Adam and Eve. And if there was not, then I find the word replenish in a very strange context there.
Absolutely. And getting to the story of Cain, when he says that you'll send me to the land of Nod and the people there would kill me. I always found that very curious as to who these other people were, if Cain and Abel were the firstborn children of Adam and Eve.
Well, it's interesting, like I say, in that first chapter, it talks about making a male and female in the image of the Elohim, and of course that would be kind of a plural or more kind of word instead of a singular word. But then the fact that the Lord God is who actually makes Adam in his image and then takes a rib to make Eve. In that first little bit of chapter in the chapter 1, it doesn't say anything about a male and female, and the female being taken from a rib. So something's a little bit standing out right there, that there's a little red flag that something else has occurred. So I typically believe in my research that this male and female was something like a pre-Adam kind of being. And of course, if you look at the Talmud, there's a lot of things that talks about that there being beasts that did not have souls. And the interesting thing is that Adam, when Adam is created, and the word Adam is used instead of the word male and female, the word, it means breath. In other words, he was giving a breath of life. And so I think that there is the difference between maybe the first and then the actual Adam that the Lord God created, in which he put, the breath of life in, and then the fact that Eve was taken from the rib of Adam. I just think that tells us that there was something else going on. And this probably is going to answer a lot of things as far as people who have said, that there were, creatures that were much like human beings, but they in fact were not human like we are, Homo sapiens. So I think that may answer some of that, Freeman, the fact that those that first couple of chapters there has the words, male and female, and then we come along with Adam and Eve and we talk about replenishing, just like we did mention before with the Noah situation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so then the story of Cain and Abel, how does that play into this Antichrist picture? How does that play into the story that's unfolding today?
Well, the first thing that I began to try to see was if there was a parallelization between the beginning and the end. And, of course, I had read back in Isaiah, and actually chapter 46 is 9 and 10 is the verse. And it says in there that the Lord actually declared the end from the beginning, so that there had to be something that was already set up from the very beginning that was going to end up making the end happen. And looking at this, I saw that there could be a very strong connectability to what he was talking about in Isaiah. If you go back and you really read, in Genesis, if you look at chapter 2, God actually marries Adam and Eve. It specifically says that they are married. They have become one flesh. So then if you look at chapter 3 of Genesis, this serpent just shows up, and he gets Eve really to eat from this tree of good and evil. And then, of course, I always thought that Adam was somewhere else, and then she went running off and took the fruit to Adam, and they both sat down and had an apple. Unfortunately, that's not really what occurred. In fact, Adam was right there watching Eve as she partook from this tree with the serpent. And then she turned around, Eve did, and she had a relationship, I feel, with Adam at the same time. Well, the fact that Adam and Eve were married and the fact that there looks like there was a sexual encounter going on, it appears that, in God's eyes, the sex was supposed to be between a man and a woman who were married. And that if you participated in sex with any other being besides your husband, that it was considered an evil act. And we see this over and over again where, the Bible, where God speaks, he hates whoredom and the mixing of paganism or with his religion or his Christianity or what he's tried to show us through the law with anything that has to do with Satan. So there just seemed to be a theme that was running central to all this that goes through God's commandments, that you're not supposed to commit adultery, that you're supposed to put God first. And it appears to me that since Eve sinned by not listening to God, that when she turned and she gave to Adam, and they partook together, apparently right in front of this serpent being, which I truly believe was, the fallen angel, Satan, that at that point in time, they had never had their conscience bother them. I believe that before this happened, that their mind was at such a state they had never seen evil. And once they participated in this, and we know this if when we were children and we were first starting to learn, that if we were in the kitchen and your mother said, don't get in the cookie jar before lunchtime, and she turned her back and you got in it, then for the first time you felt guilt. If you had never done anything behind somebody's back, you had never felt what that felt like. And then all of a sudden it was this crushing emotion that you had to hide, or you were trying to keep something from someone. And looking at this, I saw that if you had been in that state, then you would have actually, as Adam and Eve, being children, and not understanding, that there was anything evil, then participating in evil, that at that point in time, that's when the understanding of knowledge of good and evil really came about. And I found that if you look at this really closely, God really does tell us what happened, because he says, to Eve that she is going to be cursed in childbirth. And again, going back to just thinking about, if you were eating a cookie and your mama turned around, she didn't tell you, you can never go out and play in the yard because you ate a cookie. She'll just, she would say, well, you can't have cookies before dinner anymore, and don't do that behind my back. It seemed that there was a strong curse or condemnation against Eve for participating if she was just eating something, if she was just eating a piece of apple or a pear, and I've heard pomegranate. There's been all theories of what she ate. if she had been eating something, then why would he have cursed her in childbirth and at the same time forced she and Adam out of the Garden of Eden? And then on top of that, God even tells the serpent that he is cursed. And he says these words to the serpent, I will put enmity, which is positive hatred between thee and the woman, and between thy seed, Satan, and her seed, Eve. It shall bruise thy head, Satan, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And so if you look at this, you can see right there, that's telling you what Isaiah completely says, is that at that point in time, God declared the end in the very beginning. So the intent was to be able to stop Satan eventually in the future by coming against him. Well, if you look a little bit more into that, Freeman, then if Adam and Eve were there with the serpent, if Eve had a sexual relationship with the serpent, and then she turned around and she immediately had sexual encounter with her husband Adam, there is scientific proof on the record that a woman can actually give birth to two different children at the same time. They've got the same mother, but they will not have the same father. So as I looked at this and just really kept trying to understand, what was it about Cain that something was very, very, very different about Cain. And when I read chapter 4, and I have a lot of people who contact me about this because they just don't want to believe that Eve would have had a relationship with a serpent. But I'm like, the serpent is not like what we think about a snake. This serpent was something that she was not afraid of. She talked to him. He talked back to her. He was a lot smarter because he was able to fool her into thinking that, she would not die if she participated in this act. So I really feel like that, he had to have been something that was very interesting, because if he had been frightful and scary like a snake that we think about today, then he it wouldn't have been inviting to her. She'd have been too afraid of him. But instead, something happened. And so if you read on in chapter 4, you find that really actually Eve says that she has gotten a man from the Lord. And we know that the Lord was not Adam, and then she turns around and she says that she bare again and had his brother Abel. Well, the interesting thing is the name of Cain actually means acquired. So it sounds like she acquired Cain from the Lord, where Adam is involved. You find that the child named Abel actually means breath. And like we said earlier, when the breath was put into Adam, that was from God. So it appears to me from this that Abel was a breath, just as Adam was. Therefore, he was Adam's son. But with Cain, I feel that there is a break there with some commas and things, a verse break, actually in the verse itself, that makes me fully believe that Cain was of Satan. And I truly believe that is why Cain had this desire of, he wanted to do things his way. He felt stronger. He felt wiser. He felt like he didn't have to give his first fruits to God. This is no different than what we see throughout the Bible, that Satan had the same thing. He wanted to be like God. He didn't want to have to give to God. He felt like he was better. And if we go further into Genesis, we find that there are scriptural verses in Genesis 6 that tell us that there was a time when the fallen angels, the sons of God, actually came upon the daughters of men. And for many years, I had been taught that was the sons of Cain, having relationships with the daughters of the lineage of Seth, which was the third child involved in the Bible in regard to the Genesis account. But having done the research now, the words and the translations, those are words that mean Nephilim, mean giants, and there's no way that if Adam and Eve were like we are today, if they had just had a child, that child would not have been a giant. But there was giants in the land in those days. So it makes me really feel like the reason that Cain felt so much stronger and so much different, that he probably more than likely was probably a giant of some sort.
Dr. Joy Pugh. If you're just tuning in, she is author of Antichrist, the cloned image of Jesus Christ. Or did I get that right?
Right.
Sorry. Well, we were just getting into the sons of God and giants. And to me, this is a very interesting topic because there does seem to be a lot of evidence that is being covered up about giants.
That's unfortunate, too, Freeman, because I think we're not only not seeing all the archaeological findings, but I truly believe that there has been an ongoing underlying current to try to find certain artifacts and keep them from the public at large. I think a lot of the artifacts that are hid, like in the British Museum and in the Vatican museums that are not accessible to the average person, probably would tell us a lot more than what we are actually, being given in typical, museums like maybe Smithsonian. Unfortunately, the majority of people can't get in to look at those kinds of things, and they are kept locked and hidden away. And because of that, I do think that the deal with the giants and huge human-looking beings has very much been kept away from the public eye. Interesting enough, I think that as technological advances have been given to average people, then it's taken people maybe like you and I that had an interest, and you started using certain technological aspects of what we have in society now to travel and to be able to do excavations and things like that without having to maybe be from a university or from a certain group. And I think that has led to a lot of things being uncovered that the powers that be would like to keep hidden until the very last moment when they bring it forward and try to connect it all and then confuse everybody with it, because I think that's the intent, is that one day it'll be brought forward, but it will be brought forward in such a deceptive manner that if you don't have the underlying understanding that these things have occurred, it could really jar the mind. And I think it's supposed to really kind of be like that as we get to the end of time, that they're going to try to make the truth into a lie and a lie into truth. And I think we're headed in that direction if we keep our eyes closed and don't try to understand these things when something comes out that, yes, there are giants. They're very, very well were giants. The Bible tells us they were giants, and we need to understand who those giants were and why they were here.
Yeah, I agree with the confusing of this story and how they are slipping it in, because they just announced that they had found the tomb of Gilgamesh without much pomp or pageantry. Here they were admitting they had found the tomb of a giant.
Well, I think that's the thing, is that I have noticed the most. It seems to me like when I first started doing my research that it was very difficult for me to get, my hands on certain documents. And when I started putting things together, people would say, well, I didn't know anything about this. Where did you find this at? And they would be kind of question you as to, if this was even a legit piece of work or whatever. And one of the things that I mentioned in my book, Eden, the Knowledge of Good and Evil, I actually do a chapter on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And, of course, because I had done the research, I knew that there did exist a giant that was, termed the name Gilgamesh. And the interesting thing is that he was wanting to do something, what I feel like has been going through history and is parallel, it's kind of a parallelization through history with secret societies, and that is to try to find the gene that controls death so that we can eradicate the death gene in humanity so that flesh can live indefinitely in a materialistic world without having to die. And that, of course, is the main, really, theme behind the Epic of Gilgamesh, because with Gilgamesh being a giant and his parents, of course, being a fallen angel and, of course, mating with a human, he was a type of chimeric being, and he had a very, diverse genetic makeup. if you think back, even in mythology, which I think is really quite true, but it's been brought to us in such a way that it seems that is a bunch of fake things about gods and goddesses or whatever. But I think that is a tie really back to the giants. And when people say, well, how could giants or the Nephilim have had contact or fallen angels with human beings, and how could they have presented themselves with carrying children? And you have to look at that there is a possibility that a spiritual being can actually have a relationship in some form or fashion with a human being. I mean, we know that this had to have occurred even with the Virgin Mary, because she could not have carried Jesus, in her own womb if it was impossible for these kinds of things to have happened. So
well,
the fact that
with Lot's house and the angels there, if we wanted to look at it from another perspective, the angels that many of the town Denzians wanted to have sex with in Sodom.
That's right. That's right. And even Lot, he sent his two daughters out to try to deal with the men that were out there wanting to have these sexual relationships with these beings. So, I mean, if you're going to believe the Bible, and I have a lot of people who say, oh, well, I don't want to believe that there's demonic beings, and I don't want to believe there's the spiritual beings. You have to believe the whole Bible. You can't pick and choose. And it specifically says, like you say, that in Lot's day that they were there, they wanted in on those angelic beings, and to do nothing but have really sexual relationships with them. So the fact that Gilgamesh was born, and the fact that he was actually in a fallen state, in other words, when the giant died, the soul had nowhere to go, because it was already a condemned soul from the fact that the fallen angel was already in a fallen state. So Gilgamesh, as a giant, was trying to find something that would help keep his flesh alive. I mean, that's the whole reason behind the Epic of Gilgamesh, was trying to find that divine spark to keep him alive. And we even in that aspect, you can even look further in the Bible, and you can find that even after the days of Noah, that when Moses was tracking across the countryside from the wilderness there, trying to get to the promised land, he encountered giants after giants after giants. And one of the most famous ones, of course, was Goliath, that King David actually killed as a young man. And so we can't say that they did not exist, because the Bible specifically tells you that even those giants that remained were remnants of true giants. So, I mean, they were not as big, really, as the true giants that had died prior to the flood. But apparently the DNA had to be able to be mixed so that the reproduction of the children were something like, maybe, we think about hybrids, but it really was not like a hybrid. It was more like this chimeric mixing.
Bloodlines. Now, this is something I find truly intriguing, this divine right to rule, and the fact that this bloodline of these holy rollers have come through to all the lineage of our presidents, leaders of the world. And what is it with this holy blood? What is it with the bloodlines?
Well, looking back at seeing that, like I say, when Cain was born there in Eden, it appears to me that at that point in time, that bloodline, when he went off into the land of Nod, that God, of course, marked him. And the first, really, what I call royalty or whatever that's mentioned is called the dragon lineage. And it's the royal dragon lineage. And they actually used an X mark, which they used on like their shields and crests and things like that. And when you start seeing this show up after the days of Noah's flood, it comes about when you look at the Babylonian text, and when you look at some of the Sumerian text, and then, of course, you see it move on over into the Egyptian pharaohs. So that bloodline was moving itself through history, and it kind of in a secret underground kind of way. If you take and look at the Egyptians, you will find that there is a lot of what I call serpentine features and snakes and dragons and that kind of thing that shows up a lot in their writings and of course in their pictures. If you notice, you will find that especially the ruling class, the pharaohs, they had unusually elongated craniums, and something very, very, that archaeologically, that's kept hidden from the majority of people. I mean, I searched and searched to be able to get my hands on information regarding these elongated craniums years ago, and you couldn't really get anyone to say, well, they thought that they had put boards on the Egyptian kids' heads and mashed their head. I mean, that was some of the proof that this was being done, by humans, that they were making the craniums big by putting boards on the children's heads and mashing the cranium at birth so that the skull became bigger. And that just didn't really just ring true to me. When I first read that when I was younger, I'm like, why would you do that? Unless you were trying to expand the brain. But then, as time has gone on, then we have, found through our archaeological finds and people coming forward in some of these museums and things with all these big, skulls that are out there that are just oddly shaped. And even the recent findings not too long ago of King Tut's, what they called his babies, if you look at some of the pictures of that, I mean, their heads look just like what I consider some of the people that I've worked with who have had alien abductions, what they say these grays look like and how big the eyes are and the skulls are and things of that nature. So, the ruling class apparently was kind of a unique class in itself. Even the serpentine features that came through from Mesopotamia all the way to, the Babylonians, and then, of course, have moved itself through history, you find that there is a connectability back to that mark of Cain. And that lineage is definitely a reptilian connection to the serpent that was there in the Garden of Eden. And people think that, well, how could that maintain itself? You have to understand that there's a parallel history going on, and that where, for example, God tried to tell, Moses in the law for them not to mix with these pagans. When they were, going through the wilderness and trying to get to the promised land, that was one of the things that God told them, stay away from these pagans. I mean, he even told, the armies of Moses to go out and just slaughter men, women, and children. And, people have always said, well, if God's a loving God, why would he, slaughter all these people? The reason he was slaughtering them is because they were from that remnant. And that's why he never wanted the Hebrews to mix in with them. And then, of course, unfortunately, the Hebrew children did not really pay attention to what God was trying to tell them. And, of course, when they were forced into bondage with Babylonians, and they began, having children with Babylonians and that kind of thing, and then that's when the term Jew came about, because it did not really truly mean a Hebraic person anymore. It was a mixture of either having a mother who was Jewish and a father who was Babylonian or whatever, and then they had a child, and that's why they started using the term Jew. So not all Jews are true Hebraic lineages. So that's a separation there that occurred through history that really I think that the serpent was trying his best, Freeman, to try to mess up an ability for Christ to have ever been born. And if we look back at Noah, we find that the words were that Noah was perfect and to walk perfect. The intent right there is a perfect DNA that has not been mixed, because we know Noah was not a perfect individual, because after the flood he got drunk. So you can't say that he was perfect in his daily walk, because he was not. There was something else about Noah that was perfected. And that was the same thing that was in Abraham, to walk perfect in the Lord. And so when those, the 12 tribes were born from, Abraham, those 12 tribes became the Hebrew children. And like I say, God continually told them, don't mix, and to kill, men, women, and children in those other areas. He was trying to get rid of the serpent, because the serpent was trying so bad to mix in with really what was the true lineage. And the reason being, it was try to really to stop Jesus from being born, because if he could not have been born, then there would have been no redemption for mankind. And so that's why, in my book I showed that there's a genealogy that runs from Adam and Eve's son Seth all the way through the flood through Noah, and then all the way from Noah to King David, and all the way from King David until Mary. And you'll find that I specifically show in my work, especially in the the knowledge of good and evil, that it had to be that way because that was the only way that Jesus could have been born as the prophet, priest, and king. And when he came, that's what he was, prophet, priest, and king. So the intent was to keep that from happening. Now, since Satan failed at that, and when he tried to crucify him, if we notice in the Bible, when Jesus was being crucified, he did not die. He actually said, I commend my spirit. In other words, he gave up his spirit and allowed the flesh really to die. So he really did not die. He actually allowed what happened to happen. So it backfired on Satan. And then, of course, since Jesus resurrected, then Satan was forced to, how am I going to stop this again? So what he has used through history, Satan has used humanity and the bloodline that has stayed true to him. And when people say, well, I'm afraid I'm from that bloodline, if you're from that bloodline, you will never look to Jesus. It is a part of you. It is a built-in trait to be like Cain. Cain was a murderer. He was selfish. He was a killer. He thought he was better. He wanted to rule over Abel. And we see the Illuminati bloodlines.
This story is about to get much more interesting. We had to lay some groundwork there to understand where we're coming from. So I wanted to keep that going until we get to next hour when it really gets interesting. With the idea of the Merovingian bloodline, this holy blood, holy grail. Now, I'll tell you, last week I made a prediction from some of the data I was gathering that Israel will take back the Temple Mount on July 4th. This is just an Illuminati watch for me. I put these out there, and, well, so far I haven't been wrong. But so to get to that story, we gotta lead into it with the Templars and the Merovingian bloodlines and Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
That's right. And I think that it all really started back when, again, Satan wanted to stop and try to do anything he could to keep, Jesus from being born. And like I say, even when Jesus was alive, he even took Jesus up and offered him, the materialistic world. And, of course, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. So when Jesus resurrected from the tomb, he actually folded the napkin that was on his face. And if we know from the biblical scripture that when the disciples went there, that they found that folded. And interesting enough, in Jewish teaching, it is the fact that if you wad your napkin up after you've eaten, you mean you're through, you're done. But if the master gets up from the table and folds his napkin and lays it beside his plate, the servant that would be there, cleaning up the table would know not to touch the table because the folded napkin meant I'm coming back. And so Satan knew that that Jesus was coming back, and at that point in time, he had to devise a way to be able to still lure mankind away from Jesus. I mean, he had done a pretty good job in keeping the Jewish people from really understanding that Jesus was the Messiah, because they were trying to teach that, when Jesus came, that he was going to ride in on his white horse and he was going to just take over, and that there was going to be a kingdom and it was all going to be, taken care of, and there would be no more death and that kind of stuff. Well, this meant after all this happened that Satan had to come up with a better idea. And if you look back at the Gnostics, that were actually the people from which the assassins, of which Judas Iscariot was a member of, their intent, it was not that they did not know that Jesus was not the Messiah. They knew that he was the Messiah, but he was not playing the game what they wanted. They wanted to be rulers of the world, no different than what we see the Illuminati right now wanting to be, the rulers of the world and not have to answer to anyone. Again, that's still the Cain. The Cain lineage ideals is still satanic. It's still that thing that the serpent was instilling from the very beginning. So when you look at this, you see that the secret societies that had access to some understanding about what Satan was up to, as well as what Christians were starting to begin, after Jesus, of course, died, the face napkin and the shroud were left there in the tomb. And it shows up in history, again, where it becomes the cloth of Edessa. And there were people who saw this, what they called a mandolin, because they used just the face when they would show it to people, and people would be healed. So the cloth from which Christ went through is now considered, it's called the Shroud of Turin. And then there's the face napkin, that what I was talking about earlier, that was folded, that was actually now in Oviedo, Spain. And, of course, the face napkin matches the blood facial features of the shroud. That's a proven fact. But anyway, the fact that this cloth was kept and it was hidden in the wall of Edessa to keep it really from being taken away from the Christian groups that, kind of kept it as not as a icon, but as, I guess, the belief that it was not something that man had created. The image on the cloth was not a man-created image, so therefore it was not an icon.
There have been
But
a lot
anyway,
of interesting studies into the Shroud of Turin, and some believe
yes, it is definitely the most researched relic in all of history. There has never been as much research done on any other artifact that has been done, and the expenditures have been placed upon the Shroud of Turin for expertise, evaluations, and all that kind of thing. But the fact that this cloth was so important that, through history, or I was taught that the Knights Templar were actually a group of wonderful men who were out there trying to help pilgrims, return to the Temple Mount to be able, to worship. Unfortunately, those guys were derivatives of these Essenes who were a part of these assassin secret society groups, of which Judas Iscariot was a part of. And their intent was not really to help pilgrims at all. Their intent was to find all the relics of Christianity.
Well, really, how could 9 knights possibly guard a desert? There were only 9 of them to begin with.
Well, supposedly there were the 9, and so their intent was much more devious than what we have been told in history. We're gradually seeing the truth come out about this because enough people are doing research like I'm doing and going, whoa, these cats were not Christians. They were wearing a cross on their, on the front of their shirts, but that cross was an X mark. It was still that same mark that was on those serpent dragon kings from way back even in the Egyptian days. So the Templar cross was not in truth about the cross of Christ, and they were there really trying to garner all the relics and stuff and get up under the Temple Mount and find all the things that had been kept, that were supposed things that were from the days of Jesus and that kind of thing, the Ark of the Covenant, and then before Jesus where you had the Ark of the Covenant and the manna and things like that were there that was supposedly, kept and stored somewhere. So the intent was to take those relics and they knew, it was not a secret that Shroud of Turin had the blood of Jesus on it. And the interesting thing is, if the Knights Templar and the secret societies had been going through, like I'm saying, paralleling all the way from, like say, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where he was a serpent lineage, and he was searching for that divine spark to keep flesh alive, then they would have known that a piece of the Creator. Because if Jesus was the Son of God, and God being the Creator, and if that was Jesus if that was God in the flesh in the form of Jesus, then he had to have some divine spark about him. So the Templar, when they got their hands on that cloth, they took it, and they kept it in underground with them. And of course, we know that the Templars eventually were attacked by King Philip. And they went through the Inquisition. They went underground. All their treasure was given to the Knights Hospitallers, who were very good friends with the Vatican. And so they kept separate what the Hospitallers owned versus what the Templars owned. And then, before you know it, Freemasonry surfaced. And so that tells you that Freemasonry was the next step from the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller.
A cult leader from Quebec was questioned by members of the U.S. Congress today as they grapple with the moral and ethical issues surrounding human cloning. The witness, known as Rael, believes humans were created from the DNA of aliens. But he was invited to testify because, along with his bizarre beliefs, he also claims he has the technology to clone a human being. As Adrian Arsenault reports, he says he's ready to use it.
We will have eternal life. You can have eternal life. If cloning is allowed, and it's very important not to block it.
What if it doesn't work, though?
It will work.
Maybe, and that's the problem. U.S. lawmakers are now scrambling to catch up with the science.
Please rise and raise your right hand.
Assembling an eclectic group of bioethicists, animal cloning experts, and the controversial, asking, should human cloning be banned?
Those that say ban it, those would not be the Neil Armstrongs that would fly us to the moon.
Dr. Zappo says he has a list of 700 people who've signed up. Rael can do one better. Says he and his 55,000 UFO-believing followers have a secret lab, a stockpile of money, and the remains of a 10-month-old baby whose parents want a clone.
It will be done anyway, somewhere, someday, as, thankfully, nothing can stop science.
I'm very, very pleased to announce that the first baby clone is born. She was born yesterday at 11:55 a.m. in the country where she was born. So this will not give you more details about the location. She's fine. We call her Eve.
Now, that was the news from March 28th, 2001, when Rael spoke before Congress about human cloning, the fact that the Elohim were extraterrestrials that genetically modified humans. And this was just 3 years after the creation of Dolly, the cloned sheep. Now, this Raelian movement has really taken a hold, and the idea that they have brought forth, I think, very interesting, because here's this man in his puffy white spacesuit with his Star of David swastika necklace, and, of course, no one's going to believe this, man. Like, who is this guy to say that there is cloning? I think that that's a bit of a ruse in itself to make you not believe that what their claims are. Are we ready to move into cloning and how that ties into this picture of the Shroud of Turin with the...
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. The thing about it, Freeman, is interesting to me. It's just like, we had back in the 50s, we had the War of the Worlds that was broadcast to gauge people's temperature and to see whether or not they could deal with, the flying saucers and the things like that. And supposedly when all that happened, they turned around and said, this is just a fake little thing on the TV. But they didn't, on the radio, they didn't want anybody to know that because they wanted to see if people panicked. How would they deal with it? And when, of course, the American people kind of went nuts and some people killed themselves and whatever, thinking they were being attacked by Martians, then, of course, the NSA was formed and supposedly all the information in regard to the aliens was, put in a secret vault, and nobody had accessibility to the trueness about, the alien agenda or what I call the fallen angel agenda. But, you can go back and even look into some of which I guess I had such an interest in knowing what Hitler was up to, because I felt like that he was also one of those kinds of things that was being used and being funded, which we know by people that had a lot of money from the United States on his little, what I call, underground experiments. And Himmler and the boys used to get together, and they would do some remote viewing and channel people in a little place they called Camelot that they had, I guess it was like an old church that they would get in and that they would channel these spirits. And supposedly these spirits were helping them understand how to keep flesh alive, rejuvenate a body and cloning technology and that nature. And so, when Dolly was actually brought about to the world, that type of introduction was quite interesting to me, the fact that they used a sheep. and and typically, Christians are considered the sheep and that kind of thing. I just felt like that was kind of a slap in the face. But anyway,
not too different from the Raelians or Clonaid naming their first clone Eve.
Eve. And of course, you look at this, it's gauging people's temperature. It's gauging a nation. How far can we push somebody? Can we push buttons to make the masses accept a little bit of law, make it a little funny to start off with? It's like your tabloids that did the UFO kind of stuff for so long. And then you would throw a little truth in, and you'd mix a little truth in, and then you'd, move the public's mind a little further into accepting these things. I found it interesting when I did my first book, The Antichrist, the Clone Image, Jesus Christ, that David Rourke had written a book called In His Image. And that book was actually put out, and it became a bestseller, as a true book in which a billionaire named Max had actually cloned himself. And then when, the uproar began to be talked about, oh, well, you can't clone people, that would be a terrible thing, then they backed off and said it was fictional. So I think that what we're learning is that the way that these underground projects are brought to fruition and not be just, put on the back burner forever, it's brought in such a manner that it's a way for you to introduce it, to shock the system, gauge the temperature of the public and how they deal with it, but you're doing it kind of like a Hegelian principle. You're taking them from, let's say, on a scale of let's just look at the scale of the alphabet. We're all on like A maybe, and they want us to get to C or D. They want us to move us down the paradigm. So they shock us with something that's way down there around, LM, that kind of thing, or M and O. But what they've done, they've moved us from A now to accept B or C, where we might not have done that had we not thought, well, that can't be done, or I'm not going to put up with that, I'm not going to deal with that, or I don't believe that's going to happen. So what has happened is they are moving us along. And things like this Clonaid, and in fact, I had just got an article from them that after, it's been 6 years since that supposed birth of baby Eve, that this doctor, Brigitte Buzzler, who apparently Rael had turned his business over to, she has actually come forward and said they've actually had 100, babies cloned, and that they are right now looking to find someone who will have a child and come forward into the public and allow it to be seen and that kind of thing.
Right.
The thing about it is the process has already been done. I mean, this has been going on a long time. Like I say, when Hitler was doing all his little underground stuff, he was trying to find the spark of divinity. And his intent, he made it quite clear that he wanted to find something that would make a perfect race. Intent-wise was to keep anybody from dying, and that's what Himmler and the boys were looking about. How can we keep, put soldiers out there and they die and we send them back out there again? How can you make a robotic individual that can die and then live again? And the cloning aspect is giving us that. Let's look at the stem cell research that's going on right now. You can take adult stem cells, which they used to think you had to have the fetus to do this, but you can take an adult cell. And that's the thing that when people started laughing at me a long time ago about my, talking about cloning is not a hard thing to do. All you do is take an egg from a woman, you clean out the nucleus and all the DNA, and you can take a skin cell of another human being, just like they did with Dolly. You can take a human skin cell, and all of our cells are holographic. And what I mean by that is that in each cell of our body is a whole you. So, think of all the cells that's in your body. Every one of them can make a you all over again. So all you do is take that cell, you put it inside the egg, and you have to electrify it because we are all electromagnetic. So you electrify the egg, you place it back into the human or into an incubator, something that could grow it, and that cell will divide. And as it divides, if you take certain proteins and add to it, you can cause the cell to turn into another heart, another lung, another, kidney. So if you were, let's say you were in kidney failure and you needed your own kidney, you wouldn't have to worry about any rejections. They can grow you another kidney. It's not an issue. It's not a hard thing. Or if you don't use specific proteins, you can grow another you. And when it's born 9 months later and it pops out, it is an identical you. It is not a twin. It is not somebody that looks like you. It is you in the flesh all over again. The problem with all of this is that the Bible says it is only meant for men to die one time and then the judgment. There is no gene for that breath that we talked about that was in Adam. That was God-breathed. Man has no control over that soul. So when you clone something, you are actually causing a beast to be born without the nesma. And if that beast could be anything like what we mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, male and females, they could have been pre-Adamic or whatever, then we're talking even going back to the Talmud, where it speaks about the beast without a soul. And what does the Bible tell us about the man that's going to be the Antichrist? He will be a beast. It uses the word beast. And that beast is no different than what, a clone is, because it is a functional being, but it does not have a soul. So in other words, the promise of bringing you back as you truly are with a soul is not possible. Bringing back an image of you is possible. Same blood, same eye color, same hair, same nose. Everything else is the same, except you cannot redo what God did, and that was produce the soul. So this is where the Shroud of Turin has been so important to these secret societies. Satan knew that God was going to return because he left his napkin folded. The only way for Satan to ever be the Messiah of this world is to be in that image. It specifically says in Isaiah that Satan says, I will be like God. I will be like the Most High. If he is saying that, I'm going to ascend, and I'm going to be like the Most High God, then he is saying, I'm going to be in that image. So when the Shroud of Turin went through history, became, the responsibility of King Umberto. And when King Umberto died, he was in exile from Italy, he bequeathed the shroud to the Vatican. But before that happened, that was in 1983, there was already major research going on that shroud back in, the early 1960s by two important people who are now, unfortunately, strangely deceased. And that was Ganella, who was very much a engineer and a physicist. And he actually did some of the most fascinating removals of things from the shroud, and he was actually brought in by Cardinal Ballestero, who was looking at the shroud even before the Vatican really owned it. And what they were able to do is that they started pulling information off of that shroud, like blood samples and little bits of fragments from the shroud, and they were going ahead and doing some testing on that shroud back in that day. And then as they formed these committees called stirrup committees, and part of that stirrup committee, along with this Ganella, was Dr. Ray Rogers, who, again, interesting enough, is deceased now, and also a Professor Righetti, who is also deceased now. They were members of the stirrup scientific examination of the shroud. And they took these samples, and when the shroud really became the bequeathness to Pope John Paul II after Umberto passed. Of course, Umberto was a member, or his family had been members of the Knights Templar, Robert the Bruce. So there's a connectability there as to why he still had the accessibility to that shroud.
drjoy.com for more related stories. And we were up to the death of Princess Diana and the cloned Shroud of Turin. Now, how does this meet?
Well, let me just say this, that all this is important because even when Queen Elizabeth was going to become the Queen of England, it was interesting that her father, King George, only gave Elizabeth's hand in marriage to Philip when he joined the Masonic order. That was the major thing he had to do before he would allow his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, to marry Philip. The moment that he did that, 6 months later, that's when Queen Elizabeth became queen. And, of course, they were married. So that tells you that there was a Masonic connectability there to all of this. And then, of course, we know that once Charles and Diana were married, they actually went on a honeymoon, and their honeymoon was involved in going to Scotland, absolutely home to where Dolly was cloned.
Right.
And then after they left there, they went along to a little place called Wales. And interesting enough, Wales, of course, has a large red dragon right in the center of its flag. And the reason that it is considered the red dragon is that is where there was an area of people who came out of the southern area of Mesopotamia and started a large, civilization there. That they became the Black Sea area people. And what did they do? But they worshipped the serpent. So then after they returned home, that's when Diana tells everybody that, she's pregnant. And, of course, 9 months later, William arrives, and actually not even 9 months later, about 6 months later, she starts trying to kill herself while she's pregnant with William.
There were some.
She throws herself down.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go on with that.
She tries to kill herself several times. She throws herself down the staircase. So she's actually trying to kill herself and that baby. Now, that is kind of strange to me that a woman has just gotten married, had one of the biggest weddings of all time. She is now, probably going to be queen one day, with Charles. And so I'm like, what in the world changed from this wonderful wedding within 6 months later, and she's pregnant with William, and she's trying to kill herself? And when you try to get information on it, it's always that, she was kind of going through this time of adjustment, and she wasn't adjusting well. But at the same time, she was confiding in some people, including the guy that was her a bodyguard. Well, interesting enough, what happens? That guy ends up dead in an accident. So it's like everybody that was getting around her was getting taken care of, and she knew that, she was being locked down with all this. So when William comes, into being born, they take her to the hospital. And, interesting enough, nobody had ever in the royal family had been born in a hospital. But what was the name of the hospital where he's born? St. Mary's. That just kind of stands out as that's a little weird. And then you can look at what the lengthy names they gave Prince William. I mean, his name is a mile long. And actually, the royal house of Britain there, they changed their German names of Saxe-Coburg, Gotha-Battenberg to the House of Windsor and Mountbatten to make their ancestry appear more anglicized. In other words, they were actually trying to hide that they were from German descent. Okay, we're talking about the Nazis back there, who seems to have had a lot of control with being able to clone and do things like that. So there was a reason that the royal family wanted to distance their connectability to the German descent, because their people, when they were in Germany, were very much involved with Hitler's regime. So, I look at Prince Harry and him dressing up as a Nazi and all the publicity from that, and I'm thinking he's just playing the game right along with what nobody wants people to know, and that is the connectability they had to the Nazis.
Now, and then, of course, some significant astronomical events upon his birth as well?
Yes. I mean, if you look at it, when he was born, it was almost like it had to be born at a certain time, and I'm not so sure that's probably why they did what they did, because it had to be born when it was changing into Gemini, which is the twin, because he was born on the sign of the Gemini, which is June the 21st. And, of course, we think about the Gemini, we think about the twin. So who was he a twin of? And the fact
that's also the summer solstice.
It's the summer solstice as well. And even when there was some talk about him being born under the particular sign of the day he was, it was an eclipse under a king star. It meant that all the planets were in a particular degree in Leo, which would destine him to be a famous leader, according to what Diana's astrologist had told her. And all the time that when Diana would talk about William, she would not call him William. She would call him Wills. She left off the I-A-M. And what does I-A-M stand for? I am. She even said in one of the books that she did with this Simons lady that she described William as her little wise old man. In other words, he seemed to be so much older and wiser than what his age was. So that was another red flag. Another thing was in 82, when William was baptized, he was baptized in the music room of Buckingham Palace. And it was not a real big event, but he was actually christened, supposedly, by the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was Robert Alexander Kennedy Runcie. And interesting enough, the people that were there saw the baptism from using water from the River Jordan, just like John the Baptist used with Jesus Christ over 2,000 years ago. And according to the people who were there, they said that when William was sprinkled with this holy water, that he howled. They didn't even use the word cry. And I'm thinking, why would they use the terminology of howl? Now, if you know anything about exorcisms, you know that when you sprinkle someone that has a demonic being inside of them, they will howl when that water hits them. And I just thought it was strange that according to royal standards, that the future king, which would be William, would have such a little bitty ceremony. And then on top of that, they added to his godparents a man called Sir Lauren von der Post. And this was a guy that was a philosopher. He was schooled in the mystical, studies and that kind of thing. And, of course, he was Charles's spiritual advisor, but he was the mentor. And, Diana mentioned that the night that they got married, that all Charles did was read these terrible books about mysticism and all kinds of little things as far as paranormal kinds of things, and that he was just engrossed in this witchcraft kind of black magic stuff going on.
What you are stating is a belief that the Shroud of Turin gave a viable cell that they could use to clone Jesus Christ and impregnate Princess Diana.
That's right.
And so now we have Prince William. What do you think is in store for the prince?
Well, I just find it interesting that there's so many correlations to the fact that, we've been talking about the year 2012. In 2012, William will be exactly 30 years of age, and we know that according to the Bible, Jesus began his ministry at 30. If the Mayan calendar is correct, that in December of 2012, that there will be a transitional change to a new age. If you study the Mayan histories, you know that when they have these solstices, that's when the supposed serpent comes down the side of the Mayan temple down to earth. If that's the same, then of course when Jesus Christ went to the river to be baptized, of course the dove descended upon him. He began his ministry. So if William turns 30 years old, 2012, and this supposed thing happens as far as the Mayans are concerned, that the serpent will return to earth at that time, that he will start his ministry at that time, and then you would have a 7-year period. Now, the question is, like you were mentioning earlier about the Temple Mount, the Sanhedrin was reformed over a year or so ago. Their number one focus was to rebuild that temple. The temple itself can fit right next to the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock does not have to be destroyed as long as the temple it does not have the court of the Gentiles connected to it. If you set that thing down next to the Temple Mount against to the Dome of the Rock, there's so many centimeters that sit between that wall of one or the other. If for some reason they decide to do a split state there in Israel and Palestine, they could run a line right down through it, and that Temple Mount could still be built and rebuild that, the temple that was Solomon's temple that was destroyed. All the things that need to go in that temple have been done. It's all set. All it will be waiting for, and according to what the Sanhedrin are doing, they're looking for someone to be their high priest. The only person that can walk in that temple and be the high priest would have to have the blood lineage of Jesus Christ. No one else has that blood lineage. If those records were destroyed, even though we've said that, the royal families tried to connect back to it on paper, they want people to believe that. But at the moment when that person walks into the temple and proclaims himself to be God, the Vatican, who will be there holding the shroud, going, yes, this is the man. It matches this. Cloning is a great thing. We've already proved it. Look at all the 100 babies that's been born, and they're functioning, and they're the same people. And now you've got a man standing there in the image of Jesus, saying he is Jesus, with the Vatican standing there with the shroud, proving that the blood is from that shroud, and that he has a divine spark. He can bring fire down from heaven. He does have power over the air. Then people who believe that a statue of Mary bleeds blood and they are healed in this country and all over the world will flock to that image. And that's exactly what the biblical Revelation, book of Revelation says is going to happen. This has been the whole reason Satan has done what he has done, has promised from the book of Isaiah that he will be as God. And he will be worshipped as the Messiah in real life, save the world, power over the world, and give false hope to anybody that believes in him.
Sounds like Obama.
A lot of people ask me that, but Obama is a puppet of the Illuminati who will help America get to the point where all this is going to manifest itself. I mean, they've got all their key people in the right positions. You've got Tony Blair that's moved over. You've got Hillary Clinton where she needs to be. There's all kinds of people that are being moved as far as the Illuminati bloodlines to make what is going to happen when William steps into that place and proclaims himself to be God. The pedigree won't be important because at that point the blood is going to prove that he's in the image. And you can go to my website. I've got people working on looking at the images of the face, the size. William matches the shroud perfectly. He matches it perfectly.
I must agree with you. I've seen the pictures. He looks exactly like that shroud.
Yes, he does. So, I cannot tell people enough that if you will read my work and you will see the connectability of all this, I just don't believe that, that this is not true. I'm a Christian. I would not be trying to tell people. I would not be trying to warn them. And if I thought this was, false, I'm not out to make money. That's not what I did this for. My intent when I started doing my research was to try to find out what was going to happen in the end from a dream that I had when I was a child where I saw the end of time. And it has been something that I have been doing all of my life to prove to myself that I could find the person. I never dreamed I'd have the opportunity to even do a book and even be talking on radio shows about it. But I will tell you that from the bottom of my heart, I truly believe this is real. And if you don't have your life in order and you're not aware of what's going on, then I hope you take what I'm trying to tell you seriously and you do the research yourself. If you don't believe me, just take what I have written and try to do your research so that you have an understanding that if this is all going to come to pass in this generation, then Jesus Christ is coming back. He's not going to come back as a clone. He's going to come back in the air just as he promised us when he left the disciples years ago. And you cannot be confused because as time gets even closer to this event happening, everything's going to look like a lie is going to be a truth and truth is a lie, and you can't tell the difference. So right now I pray that people will start doing their research so that as the days get closer to this, that you have your eyes open and you're not deceived by what Satan has planned, because he's got a lot of capability to deceive us.
Well, that puts it right there in the place, doesn't it? And to me, it feels like it's the entire system that we exist in. As I say, I find the 666s all over corporate logos,
yes.
The connections with Freemasonry. I believe our entire system of government and civilization as we know it is the mark of the beast, as it were.
Yes, and I just find it interesting that William is a part of the Royal Air Force and that Satan has power over the air.
It's just on and on, isn't it?
Yes, and he did sign up for another 7 years, so he's not getting married, just like I told everybody a long time ago. He's not going to get married because that's not what his agenda is.
Well, we're going to have to keep watching, I think, and praying, I guess, because, we've got a minute left. Is there something that you might want to offer as what to do?
Well, the intent is just to live your life the way you choose. In other words, if you choose to be on the good side, then that's the one thing. Because in the end, the Bible says, it's told us all this is going to happen. It's told you that either you're going to be a part of the sheep or a part of the goats. I can't take you to anything but to the water and give you the water, but you've got to drink. You've got to make your mind up. And I just hope that you will read my research. If you've got any questions, that you will email me. You'll go to my website, www.drjoye, that's drjoye.com, and I'll be glad to share with you what I have found. I hope you'll look at the videos that I have there on my website, and I hope you'll tune in to Coast on Monday night and hear me with George Norrie.
Well, I'm truly looking forward to that. I'd like to hear the 3-hour synopsis instead of the quick minutes that we have here. Well, Dr. Joye,
hopefully I can be back on your show again, Freeman, and we can go a little bit slower and do just little portions of it so that we can get more into detail about each one of these little items.
All right, we'll work that in. Thank you, Dr. Joye, and please check out our website, Dr. Joye. That's JOYE.com.